Hello, everybody. I'm Charlie Teedy, and I'm really excited and happy to be with you today to deliver today's Sunday school lesson for 4th through 6th graders at Ebenezer United Church of Christ in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Today's lesson title is Promises and Passover. And in this lesson, we're going to see and talk about promises from a God perspective and promises from a personal perspective, as well as learn a little bit about the Jewish holiday of Passover, how it came to be, and how it's celebrated, why it's celebrated, and how that relates to the idea of God's promises to all people. So I hope I can have your attention for the next 12 minutes or so, and we will get started shortly. All right, so first of all, we're going to talk about promises. Promises are easy to make, but they're hard to keep, and I think we all know what I'm talking about. You know, I love music, and one of my favorite songs is by Brian Sergio, who's a UCC pastor down in the Madison area. And his lyric, which is up on the screen right now, says, "Sometimes when I'm feeling strong, I make promises that I can't keep." And that's very true, I believe, of all of us. What are those types of promises? Well, I'm going to treat people more nicely. I'm not going to fight with my brother or sister anymore. I'll make my bed every morning. I'll do my schoolwork before I go on social media or watch television. Or I'm going to help you on that church project that we have. So we make those promises very easily to other people. Sometimes we make them to ourselves, and sometimes we make them to our parents or to our friends or to anybody. But what happens when we don't keep a promise? What does it mean when a promise that we've made is broken? Well, typically we feel really embarrassed. And I mean embarrassed. The other side of that is when people make promises to us that they don't keep. And how do we feel then? We feel sad or depressed or angry with the person who didn't keep the promise. It's not a good feeling. And when people break promises to us, we need to remember how that feels so that we don't break promises to other people. If you saw last week Sunday school lesson, you probably remember hearing the story of Joseph, the youngest son whose father gave him this very colorful coat and made his brothers very, very jealous. So jealous that they dug a pit and threw him into it, hoping that he would die. He didn't die. He was rescued by some traders coming past that pit, who pulled him out of the pit and took him to Egypt and sold him to the household of the Pharaoh or king of Egypt. Well, the long story short is that eventually Joseph was reconciled with his brothers. He became a very powerful man in Egypt as a lieutenant to the king. And his brothers all moved their families to Egypt and for many years lived a wonderful life due to Joseph's influence in the kingdom of Egypt. So today's Bible story is from the second book in the Bible, or second book in the Old Testament of the Bible, the book of Exodus. And this is a story of the people in Israel, not in Israel, but in Egypt, the descendants of Joseph and his brothers, and how things had turned so awful for them. Over time, they fell out of favor with the Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, and were forced into slavery to do all the dirty work and the hard work in the kingdom of Egypt. And this is one of those stories that there are many of them in the Bible that talk about God's promise. And in this case, a promise to a specific person and the people of Israel. So there was a man named Moses who was a descendant of Joseph and his brothers' families, who lived in Egypt and felt that God had spoken to him and said, "You must lead your people out of slavery and out of Egypt." Moses was spoken to by God. Now, regardless of whether he was literally spoken to God or he had this deep-seated feeling, he took on that task because he felt he had a promise from God to help him achieve that. And I think it's important to remember that God promised to help Moses, not do all the work and do everything that was needed, but to simply help Moses through this process. So Moses went to Pharaoh and said, "You have to release the people of Israel from slavery here and allow me to lead them out of Egypt back to our homeland in Israel." Well, Pharaoh more or less laughed in his face and said, "Get out of here. That's not going to happen." Moses said, "Well, if it doesn't happen, there are going to be some terrible things taking place here in Egypt because you won't let us go." Well, as it turned out, there were a lot of bad things that started happening in Egypt. They're called plagues. One of those involved the water turning red to the color of blood, making it undrinkable. Now, some people think that was simply red algae, but nonetheless, that was a problem, no drinking water. Then there were plagues of insects and frogs, insects over everything, frogs in people's beds. But none of this seemed to change Pharaoh's mind about this. Every time there was a plague and Moses went to him and said, "Will you let my people go?" he said, "Nope, we got past that. Not a problem. You're still going to be slaves and you're going to stay here." So this brings us to the story of the Passover. So the Israelites in Egypt celebrated a festival, and that involved a very elaborate, drawn-out meal on the night that they observed this festival. And you can see some pictures here of people gathered around and then what the food looked like. Moses again went to Pharaoh and said, "If you do not let my people go, there is going to be a horrible event. All of the firstborn sons of the people in Egypt are going to die tonight." And of course, Pharaoh thought that sounded outlandish and again said, "I'm not worried about that." So Moses went to the people of Israel and said, "What you need to do is you need to sacrifice a lamb, and you need to use that lamb's blood and paint the door frame around your door of your house as a sign that you are protected from what is going to come." So the faithful people of Israel did that, and that was based on Moses' understanding that God had promised that if this sign was given, the sacrifice and the blood, that the angel of death would pass over those houses. And that's what the word Passover comes from. So that night, when the Israelites were celebrating their meal, an angel of death or some other type of illness came over the land of Egypt, and the next morning, as Moses had predicted, the firstborn son of every family in Egypt was found dead, except for those families who had painted their doorsteps, or their doorposts, I should say, with blood. So the promise of God to Moses to pass over the Israelites' homes was fulfilled. And not just the firstborn sons of Egypt were dead, the Pharaoh's own firstborn son was also dead. So he summoned Moses to the palace and told him, "Get your people out of here. I don't want to see you again." So Moses left. So that's the origination of Passover, and it's still celebrated today in April, more or less around our Easter time. But Jewish people celebrate, the descendants of the Israelites celebrate Passover, and even in some Christian congregations, the Seder meal, which is associated with Passover, is observed, using the same foods that go back to ancient times. So it's a reminder of God's promise to people to lead them out of slavery in Egypt. But it also extends to the promise that God has made to all people. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what those promises are. So, what are God's promises? In my mind, they're pretty simple. The first thing is that God is with us and within us, always, no matter what's going on or what we're going through. The second thing is that God's love is unconditional. Doesn't matter what messes we create, what bad things we do, that doesn't change God's love for us. So God's Spirit within us and the love and forgiveness that are involved with that have the power to heal not only us when we suffer, but other people when we reach out to them and show God's love in all the ways we can. You may have other ideas about God's promises, but that's what makes sense to me. So let's review our highs and our lows and our God sightings for the past week. I want to thank Aaron Robley for sharing his. His high for the week was being able to play with his friends from his class at school. His low was not being able to play with his friends who are in another class at school. I'm assuming that's because of the COVID-19 restrictions that are in place to keep people safe. Aaron's high for, or God sighting for the week, was that he just had a really great week. And I think that's a pretty good God sighting. For me, my high for the week was being able to get together with the other members of the Still Speaking Band and record some music. We did this at church, and we were distanced. Took a little bit of setup work, but we were recording 3 songs for an upcoming event that's going to be online related to the Church Men and Women United Scholarship Fund. My low for the week was hearing about the death of one of my dad's longtime friends. And my dad is 93 years old, so at that age, you don't have many friends left. And that made me think a lot about how time changes things. My God sighting for the week was I was on a drive and I decided to drive down to the lakefront, and Lake Michigan was spectacular. If there's anything that makes me realize how wonderful our creation is and about the concept of God, that is one of those things. Absolutely beautiful. And how wonderful for us to live in such a beautiful place. Well, that does it for this week. I hope to see you at some point in the future. Have a great week and keep thinking about your highs, lows, and God sightings. And remember about God's promise. See ya.